With so many Albany scandals making so many headlines, lots of people continue to ask what's wrong with the New York state government and how can we fix it? Those questions and how to make Albany more effective were the themes of a seminar at NYU yesterday, led in part by a friend of the show and NYU professor Richard Brodsky. The event drew some big names offering a number of opinions about Albany and what to do about it.
You can't avoid having conflict of interest. If you say you can't be in a legislative body and you can't work, what if your wife works? Are you going to say your wife can't work? Suppose your wife works for a union. Does that make every vote you cast in favor of benefits for working people a corrupt act? Where do you draw the line?
Strong enforcement, not enforcement for the sake of being tough, but to make sure that people know that in every county of this state there are prosecutors who are empowered to investigate and act where appropriate, not for political purpose but for the right purpose, and we don't have those laws today. And frankly, I think that puts the burden on the federal government to do all of it, and they can't do it all.
You may not be able to prosecute it away completely, but I think a couple of high-profile prosecutions might reduce it. And when I do think that if you see powerful people being indicted and convicted and going to prison, it might actually have some discouraging effect. So I don't want to sneeze at the prosecuting away.
What's really important is an emphasis on ethics and morality. It's changing the culture in Albany. Right now, and maybe this is a function of a relatively low salary and the ability to have outside income, there is what I term a culture of entitlement. I've given up a lot to be a public servant, so I deserve some back, and the way I get that back is through per diems and through use of campaign funds and things that everyday New Yorkers find unsavory. So we need a better balance.
That's just a small slice from that event. For the full interviews and other thoughts from former City Comptroller Bill Thompson, Syracuse Mayor Stephanie Miner, and lots more, head over to our YouTube page. We're going to post everything this weekend. You'll be able to see it about 24 hours from now on our YouTube channel. But, I got to say, it was an interesting event with some really prominent figures and people whose thinking you respect. And it seemed like nobody was on the same page in terms of charting a path for making Albany work any better. And Phil, I found that more depressed. I was more depressed when I left than when I went in there.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what the scope of that conference was. I assume it was, we're going to come up with a set of ideas and principles on how to fight corruption. Well, we have a U.S. attorney that's doing that. I don't know exactly what they have in mind. Maybe you have a better insight on that. But I'll tell you one thing. You want to stop corruption? Stop voting for these people and go out and vote. Or don't vote at all. How about we organize a statewide boycott of voting, and nobody gets any votes? That'll stop it. You'll sure get their attention.
That doesn't seem that realistic. I mean, because then the people who can corruptly pull the most votes are the ones who are going to win.
I write a column. I don't have to be realistic. My job is to irritate.
Okay, so
and I think that would be a perfect way to why encourage them?
So,
right, Dominic?
But first of all, most incumbents get reelected, you know as well as I do, and most voters have no idea if their elected official is corrupt or isn't corrupt. And I did hear that at the conference yesterday. Right. Get to know your elected officials and ask them if you're not happy with the results. But how are people really supposed to know?
You can never fully stop public corruption in terms of elected officials. But, and I know he doesn't win the most popular award these days from elected officials, U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, but that's a good way of stopping corruption. Now, I know that he's been criticized, Bharara, the man we're looking at right now, for being too public in the media, but he's redefining the rules. He's going after elected officials, and if it ties to a son, he's going after the son, and all of Albany is screaming bloody murder against him. But that's how you put a major dent when you put the fear of God in these elected officials.
Well, and I think Dominic's point speaks to what we heard from Richard Briffault, who's the chairman of the Conflict of Interest Board in New York City, that high-profile prosecutions might actually help with all this. But we already had Joe Bruno before we wound up with Shelley Silver, and we had Shelley Silver before we had Dean Scott? I mean, it just seems like there have been a number of high-profile arrests.
Well, there have, and you know, I mean, I was being somewhat facetious about the idea of not voting, but I'll tell you something. You know, a lot of these guys, they get indicted. Sometimes they get convicted, and sometimes they even go to jail. They usually get the usual 14-month treatment, and then they're out, and they get to collect their pensions. And I'll tell you, the one thing I hear from readers whenever you write about another assemblyman, you know, getting caught with his hand in the cookie jar, or a state senator who's, you know, screwing around with his taxes, is why do they get their pension? Why? And I tell you, if you took that away, because it's pretty substantial in some cases, and some of these guys have been around, they last for 30 years, some of them, or more, and they build up a pretty hefty pension. Now, this gets into another whole debate about whether or not that's fair, but I'll tell you, if they really were serious about it, that would stop this.
You know, the more we hear about Dean Skelos and we hear about Shelley Silver and we hear about Carl Hastie, the less we seem to be hearing about Andrew Cuomo. And I'm just curious what your sense is as to what he. You think he knew what he was opening, the can of worms he was opening with Moreland, and do you think he deserves more heat than he's gotten for pulling down the Moreland Commission?
Deserves more heat. I think he's feeling the heat, and I think it's the Sheldon Silver indictment. I think it's all those things, because when he left it hanging, that's when Bharara, anytime you do something like that, where you create a void, a vacuum, someone's going to fill it. And it's exactly what the U.S. Attorney did, and it's still going on. I mean, Moreland is still out there. It's just, you know, it hasn't come to the fore in recent weeks because we're thinking about other things right now, like Bridgegate, for one thing.
With elected officials up in Albany, they are almost afraid to talk each other because you don't know who's wearing a wire. Now, some may say that's a bad thing. I say it's a good thing.
Cuomo too? Do you think Cuomo's feeling that here, or do you think he's looking behind him to hear if there are footsteps?
No, I don't even think the corruption bug comes close to the governor. But as far as his actions with the Moreland Commission and, you know, disbanding it and so on, I agree that he is feeling, with Phil, that he's feeling the heat as it relates to that.
All right, we'll take a break. Up next, we're going to move south to Baltimore. 6 police officers from Charm City involved in the arrest of Freddie Gray now facing criminal charges. Prosecutors slammed them for just about everything they did that day. Question is, will this end the protests that have spread to cities just about everywhere?